So, the Indian Act. It's a name you hear a lot, but it's one of the most foundational and honestly most misunderstood pieces of Canadian law. To really get what it's all about, we've got to go back. We need to look at the ideas that even made it possible in the first place, and then really unpack the powerful legacy of control it left behind for First Nations in Canada. You know, this question from the Assembly of First Nations, it just stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? I mean, how could you discover a place that was already home to millions of people, with their own societies, their own laws? This really gets to the absolute heart of the matter. It challenges the entire premise of colonization, and wow, does it ever set the stage for what happens next. Okay, so to even begin to understand how a law like the Indian Act could be created, we have to rewind way back. We need to look at the powerful idea that was used to justify everything. And here it is, the doctrine of discovery. Now, this wasn't just some vague thought bubble. No, this was a formal, legal, and moral justification that came straight from the Pope in the 1400s. And get this, it was based on the idea that European Christians were superior, which gave them the right to claim lands, basically ignoring the fact that people already lived there. It was the ideological engine for colonialism. It effectively dehumanized entire populations and just dismissed their societies, their laws, their very existence. This doctrine, it's the root from which everything else grows. So, how does a religious idea from the 1400s turn into actual British law in North America? Well, the next major piece of the puzzle is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Okay, so picture this. It's 1763. Britain just defeated France in the 7 Years' War. Suddenly, they're in charge of these huge new territories. They desperately need a way to manage it all, especially their relationship with their First Nations allies. So, King George III issues this incredibly important document, the Royal Proclamation. Now, this proclamation is a really mixed bag. On one hand, it sounds pretty good, right? It sets aside Indian territories and says First Nations should not be molested or disturbed. It even stopped private settlers from just buying up land. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. It also established that if land was to be sold, it could only be sold to the Crown. See what happened there? It protected Indigenous lands from settlers, sure, but it did so by making the government the one and only gatekeeper for any future land deals. That's absolutely crucial. All right, so that proclamation really sets the stage for the next major development. We fast forward about a century, and now we've got a new country called Canada, and it decides to take all these old colonial policies and roll them into one single powerful law. And that law, passed in 1876, was the Indian Act. Now, it's so important to understand this. This was not a treaty. It wasn't an agreement between two groups. It was a law, plain and simple, imposed by the Canadian government to create one single, unified way of dealing with First Nations people. And this slide really lays it all out. You see, treaties were supposed to be nation-to-nation negotiations, a conversation about how to share the land. The Indian Act was the complete opposite. It was a top-down law forced by one government onto hundreds of different distinct nations. And it had a very, very specific goal in mind. So what was that goal? Well, in a word, assimilation. The whole point of the act was to systematically erase Indigenous culture and identity. Here's how it was supposed to work. Step 1, the government gets to decide who legally counts as an Indian. Step 2, replace traditional forms of governance with their own system of band councils. Step 3, control pretty much every aspect of life, from land to resources. And finally, Step 4, push people to voluntarily give up their legal status and identity, a process they called enfranchisement, to just blend in and become like any other Canadian citizen. Okay, so that's the plan on paper. But what did all this control actually look like for people, day to day? This is where the dry legal stuff becomes a really harsh reality. The government put these officials called Indian agents on reserves, and these guys had almost unbelievable power. For instance, they could enforce something called the pass system. Just think about this. You would need a signed permission slip from the agent just to leave your own community. It was basically total control over your freedom to move. And the act was also a weapon for systematic cultural suppression. I mean, look at this timeline. Core spiritual ceremonies, things like the potlatch and the Sundance, which were central to governance and culture, were literally outlawed. Why? Because they reinforced Indigenous identity. For decades, practicing your own culture was a criminal act. You couldn't even show up in public wearing traditional clothing. And it's just wild to think these bans weren't lifted until 1951. And the level of control was just staggering. It went into every corner of life. The act decided who you could marry, stripping women of their status if they married a non-status man. It was the legal justification for residential schools. It literally renamed people with European names and forbade them from speaking their own languages. It even made it illegal to organize politically to try and fight back. And get this, they created a permit system, so a farmer needed the Indian agent's permission just to sell their own products. It completely crushed any hope of economic independence. So after hearing all of that, the obvious question is, if this law was so incredibly harmful, why on earth does it still exist? Well, the answer is really, really complicated. Yeah, this is the big question, isn't it? It's the central problem that policymakers and First Nations leaders are wrestling with right now. Because as it turns out, you can't just flip a switch and turn it off. And here's why it's such a dilemma. Over on one side, you have all the terrible parts of the act we've just talked about. The control, the assimilation. But on the other side, well, after 150 years, the act has become this tangled legal foundation for everything. It's the basis for federal funding and programs, it's what defines status, and it provides some, albeit limited, protections for reserved lands. So if you just repealed it tomorrow without anything to replace it, you'd create this huge legal vacuum. It could actually put essential services and even land rights at risk. And that's exactly why, for so many First Nations, the conversation isn't about how to tweak or fix this old colonial law. Not at all. The real goal is to move past it completely, to replace the Indian Act with new systems based on the inherent right of self-government and self-determination, and finally put control back where it belongs, with Indigenous nations themselves. The Indian Act really wove this legacy of control deep into the relationship between First Nations and Canada. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. Even with all the changes and amendments over the years, what parts of that control still linger today?